thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us today. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about, and it's about how do we do virtual requirements meetings and really kick them up a notch. You know, conference calls are so typical in our environment. They become part of our culture and a huge part of our workday. And as we talk about conference calls, I'm really hoping we can give you some tools, techniques, tips, and some great advancements in how to run those conference call meetings. You know, a really staggering statistic, 20% of people have admitted to falling asleep on a conference call. And I know we'd all like to believe it hasn't happened on my call, but maybe you've come close to that moment on other calls. And conference calls are painful. There's no doubt about it. My question for you, and of course I don't really have a way to necessarily see your reaction, but which are most painful for you, the ones that you host or the ones that you attend? I know if we really think about that, I think there's pain on both ends of the spectrum. And fun. But here's some of the problems that we're dealing with today that I'm sure you can relate to as well. As IT professionals, we typically each are individually responsible for about $1 million per year in spend on conference calls. So if you're thinking, oh my gosh, that number is absolutely huge, how do I get there? Well, I'm thinking that if you're hosting about 4 hours a day of meetings for conference calls with about 10 people on the line on average, that's how we get to $1 million a year in spend. And what's crazy about this is that, you know, we need approval for a couple $100 for something, but yet we don't need approval to spend that much money on our conference calls. Yet how much time gets wasted on conference calls due to multitasking or folks not paying attention, or maybe the meeting just isn't quite the right meeting for you or your participants. What's also interesting is that the number one source of missed and poor requirements is a lack of stakeholder involvement. So if we bring these two things together in a virtual environment, we've got the number one source of missed requirements being lack of stakeholder involvement, and then a waste of conference call dollars being spent in our corporate environment. And this really, really collides into a pretty big problem. And I'm guessing that's part of the reason you're here today, is you're resonating with that, right? People are multitasking, and you might be hearing toilets flushing and people playing solitaire while they're on your calls, dogs barking in the background. All this kind of stuff is happening on our calls, right? I want to talk about how engagement on these calls is really the key aspect to getting what we need from our conference calls. We need to be engaged and plan for engagement. So if we think about our conference calls, we still have to apply some of the basics of our meetings to those calls. So for example, any meeting we have, whether it's in person or virtual, does need a purpose defined that's very, very clear to everybody. Everybody needs a role who's on the call aligned to that purpose, and they need to understand what's in it for them. So purpose, role, and what's in it for me helps me participate in the call in a better way. We also have to, as a host, make sure that we are not boring folks on the call and that we're providing a fit for content and activities. So people are multitasking, what I find, is because they don't understand what the meeting is all about. They got invited, they dial in, but they're like, I don't really know what this call's about or why I'm on it. People don't understand their role in the dialogue, so they tune out really, really quickly, and they don't understand what's in it for them. And why do they behave badly and take over the call or start multitasking and such? Well, they're not sure they understand how they fit into the meeting, so it's super easy to tune out. And they're bored out of their minds and not sure how to contribute. So if they're catching themselves wanting to contribute but bored, they're likely going to behave badly on the call, interrupt, take over, or go off onto their own agenda. So those are some of the key influences to our calls. And next I want to talk about how we can truly change this dynamic. Because we absolutely can change things on our calls. We can get everybody engaged. And in this webinar, I really want to focus on the engagement and boredom aspect, assuming that you've already got a purpose well-defined and communicated, roles well-defined and communicated, and the what's in it for each participant also communicated. So once that's established and we get everyone on the call and we're planning for exactly how are we going to run the meeting, this is when we get everybody engaged. So they literally have so many of their senses involved, it's really absolutely impossible for them to multitask and be bored. So I'm going to open our minds up to some tools and techniques that probably for some of you are going to be brand new. Others may have heard of some of these or used some of them. But we can do this when we're reviewing requirements, gathering requirements, eliciting, analyzing, brainstorm, modeling, and providing feedback on requirements. What we want to do in our calls is get their attention. And there's tons of virtual tools that support requirements facilitation techniques. So where I'm going with this is talking about things like sticky note brainstorming virtually, sticky note grouping, whiteboard drawings and models and giving feedback to models and drawings on the whiteboard, visual analyses and analogies and matrices, multi-user documentation, annotations, and prioritization. So all these types of things that you should be doing in your requirements meetings and requirements calls can be done in a way other than our traditional just voice-only calls or presentation calls. So with that, I want to also talk about an aspect of how we got to where we are. Basically, our meetings that we have where we all sit around a room and one person talks, or if we translate that to a virtual environment, we all dial into a phone line and we're all vying for airtime or no one talks at all, right? Well, what this is a dynamic that I like to call the push and pull of meeting participation. Push is a style of a meeting where we present information out without really engaging folks who are expecting feedback back. Now, you could say that this webinar is an example of push. Push-style meetings are great for very, very large audiences where it's just too difficult to get everybody participating and engaged, and it's good for presenting information. Pull is the other dynamic, and that's a dynamic where we want to generate dialogue, get feedback, get ideas, options, alternatives, engagement, discussion, and contributions from the audience. So when we think about what we do as IT professionals, I actually think it's very rare that we do push meetings. In fact, I would say our meetings as IT professionals are really rallied around the pull, meaning we want to generate dialogue, get feedback, get engagement going in our meetings. And in a traditional on-site, in-person meeting, these dynamics get really, really boring if we're just sitting around a table when we need to generate dialogue and it's not working very well. Well, I think the problem becomes magnified even huger in a much larger way when we're on the phone. So if we think about requirements meetings specifically, our purpose is almost always to pull for the majority of the meeting. When we pull, we're looking at consensus building, developing shared understanding amongst the group, problem solving, getting feedback on things, discussing options and alternatives, making decisions, eliciting requirements gathering, and analyzing different points of view and scenarios. So we do this in our requirements meeting when we're planning requirements, confirming scope of a solution, gathering requirements, prioritizing all types of things, demos and prototyping and reviewing and validating our requirements. All of these types of things need that feedback and shared understanding. And so our typical conference calls where we're talking or pushing a slide deck or a Word document out just doesn't work very well. In fact, I would argue that it takes longer. And what I'm finding is leaders today, of course, are pushing all of us to do requirements much faster. Everyone wants requirements done yesterday. Once our customers and business groups have thought of a solution they wanted it yesterday, right? So we need to find ways to get through requirements faster. And I believe these techniques really, really help.